Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Peacock. My guest today is Massie, a veteran in the martial arts business scene. In this episode, Mike combines his knowledge of curriculum design and business development to show why you should implement a rotating curriculum and how to do it. Properly applied, a rotating curriculum makes your life as an instructor easier while driving greater business value to your students. Mike is well known for the business resources he has produced. Stay tuned till the end to find out how you can get a discount on them. So if you're excited to dive in, hit the subscribe button on your podcatcher now. Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast, Mike Massie. I'm really glad to get you on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here. Sure.
I've been a big fan of the resources you put out through Small Dojo, Big Profits, and some of your other websites. I think what's your other one? Is it MABiz?
So I have martialartsbusinessdaily.com, which is the blog, and not really active on there anymore. I don't post very regularly. I posted, weekly or bi-weekly for, maybe 2-3 times a week sometimes for years. And then once I started writing fiction and doing other things, I just didn't have time for it. Same thing with my newsletter. I rarely email my newsletter list anymore because I'm focusing on other things. But I do still do quite a bit of work with my personal coaching group, Martial Arts School Owners Coaching Group, which you can find at mabizu.com or martialartsbusinessu.com.
Nice, very nice. And you've written quite a few really helpful little ebooks that you have published on Amazon they're like what $3 a pop or whatever.
They're cheap. Yeah. The most actually I put them almost all of them due to the pandemic on a 50% discount, but the most expensive one was most expensive ebook was like $10, and then the cheapest 99 cents. And I created those materials, number one, because when I started to transition out of running martial arts studios, I anticipated that I would be doing consulting work for martial arts school owners, business coaching for a while, but that at some point I would also transition out of that. And I had a bunch of information floating around in my head, things that I had picked up from other instructors, from networking and stuff that I'd created and innovated over the years on my own schools, my own systems. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to get those down on paper. So I decided to start blogging books. And instead of blogging, I used my newsletter, and I would send out a daily newsletter. I did this for about 2 years, and I wrote most of those books via my newsletter. So I gave the information away for free at first, then compiled it into books and published it on Amazon. So you can find tons of my stuff cheap on Amazon.com. And I did that because I know a lot of martial arts instructors, when they're first getting started, they just don't have a lot of financial resources. We tend to be the type of people that we we would rather be doing martial arts all the time, and a lot of the martial artists that I know that teach, they hadn't invested a lot of time and effort into their own other careers, I should say. Okay. So usually we're the type of guys, I was the same way when I was younger. I would just work any old job I could find that afforded me the time and enough money to be able to train martial arts. And that was it. Yeah. And my goal was to start a full-time martial arts studio.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to have some resources out there for guys that couldn't afford my other stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think I've bought almost all of them. I think I was on your email list when you were emailing most of those out. I remember getting emails from you like multiple times a week and like talking about tribes and all kinds of different important marketing and branding concepts for you to actually build a sustainable business and not just, your face in teaching lessons.
Yeah. Yeah. And, a lot of that stuff that I talked about, nobody else was talking about it at the time. I think it's kind of interesting, when I first wrote Small Dojo, Big Profits in 2003, I had just sold, or I was in the process of selling my first martial arts school after running it for 10 years. And I'd been teaching for about probably 15 years at that time. And I was fed up with the industry. You can read that story in the book. But
yeah.
I find it interesting that back then, nobody was talking about running small, highly profitable studios, and now everybody talks about it. Additionally, back then, you had a lot of gatekeepers at that time. The internet wasn't yet in full swing. That didn't happen for a few years yet. Google wasn't a thing. I think Yahoo was probably the dominant search engine at that time. So it was interesting. I kind of jumped into marketing online to publish that book myself, self-publish it and market it myself. And, I don't want to take full credit for it, but I think I was probably me and maybe, John Graydon too, were probably the first people out there that were independent business coaches that were doing our own thing online, separate from, any, major corporation or, large business in the industry.
Yeah. I think John Graydon's with, like the Martial Arts Industry Association or something like that, Centuries kind of thing now. But
no, he actually started NATMA, which is the National Association of Professional Martial Artists. A lot of people don't know this history, so I'll just lay it out for you.
Okay.
So, and this is getting off on a tangent, but it's important that people understand this. Sure. So John Graydon was the first guy to start one of the box programs, what we used to call box programs, where they would send out martial arts business information every month in a box to you as a school owner for like, say, $99 a month, right? You would subscribe to this and you would get like a DVD or a CD, which tells you how long ago this was, with all the information you wanted, with ads, and you'd get ad slips and things like that. He was one of the first people to start doing that, if not the first. And so he created NATMA, and then he ended up, for one reason or another, getting sued by one of the large martial arts suppliers, manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, for one reason or another, which I won't get into.
Okay.
And so he ended up losing National Association of Professional Martial Artists because of that lawsuit.
Yeah.
And he ended up starting Martial Arts Teachers Association, which is what he runs now. So John's actually a good guy. He's been around for a long time, and I actually like him. So
I see him in marketing groups on Facebook sometimes. I always get a kick out of it because I'm the only one who knows who he actually is.
And the thing is that he's been around for forever, and at one time he did run a very large, successful martial arts studio. Plus, through running National Association of Professional Martial Artists, he interviewed a ton of people. So he's been around for a long time. He deserves some respect, even though I think there are certain people in the industry who would just rather sweep him under the rug. But whatever.
Oh yeah, definitely. I respect us, and he was a good martial artist too. So I mean, respect all the way around.
Yeah, Joe Louis Black. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, that's a big deal. So, kind of pivoting towards the topic of today, one of the helpful ebooks that you wrote was Rotating Curriculum, which is, when I bought it, I think it was $3. So it's well worth your money. And you said you discounted it like 50% during the pandemic.
I think it might be. I can't remember what I priced everything at, but yeah, everything's been on sale since the pandemic.
Regardless, it's only $3. So guys, go out and get it.
That book is, the funny thing about that book, Josh, is that people either love it or hate it. And it is probably the most polarizing thing I've ever written as far as martial arts business resources go. We can get into why a little bit later, but it's a funny little thing about that book.
Oh, I definitely want to get into why, because it's probably, if I'm anticipating what you have to say about it, I think it's one of the reasons why this show exists.
Okay.
So for those unfamiliar, how would you summarize what a rotating curriculum is? Okay.
So rotating curriculum in a nutshell, and I didn't create this. I didn't come up with this idea. I actually learned about rotating curriculums or curricula from other instructors that I was working with way back in the day. But a rotating curriculum, it's a curriculum that repeats itself in a logical manner in such a way that it allows you to teach large groups of students and multiple ranks in the same class at once.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And I can I can kind of delve deeper into that if you'd like.
Yeah. Just dig it one more level deeper into it.
Okay. So a rotating curriculum what it does is, or what you're doing when you teach according to a rotating curriculum, instead of teaching techniques in a linear fashion, like the way I came up through the ranks, I started off in traditional Taekwondo and traditional Keishinkan and Shotokan karate, right? So the way we learned when I was coming up was you learn X techniques for X belt. You learn those movements in a specific order, those kata in a specific, way, in a specific order. You didn't learn like say, if the first kata was Takioka Shodan or Pinan Shodan or Heian Shodan, whatever you want to call them. And you learn the Takioka form first, maybe you learn all 3 Takioka forms if your school taught those, and you had to learn those first. Then you would go on to the Pinan or the Heian katas, and then you might learn like, Taki Shodan or Naihanchi, and you would go on to like, Basai Dai and move on from there, right? So that's the way you learn forms. Or if you're in the Korean system, you had the 8 Palge forms, or you had the, the newer forms, the Taeguk forms. Yep. And you would learn those in a specific order, and you did not learn the second form until you learn the first form. You did not learn the third form until you learn the second form, and so on. Everything had to be done in a linear fashion. Well, with a rotating curriculum, you don't do that. What you do with your students is that your students at a particular level of skill, or particular, I guess you'd say, people who hadn't reached a certain, I guess you could say like, point in their learning, depending on how you break up your curriculum, everybody learns the same thing at once. So for example, in my schools, when I set it up, I was still teaching traditional karate and traditional Taekwondo. I had learned a traditional system, Changmukwan Taekwondo, actually, which is very closely related to Japanese karate due to the history of that system and the founder. The founder was actually a 4th degree black belt in Shotokan karate. So I learned Changmukwan Taekwondo and I learned Shotokan karate kind of simultaneously because my parents were split and I lived with both parents at different times of the year. So I would study Taekwondo part of the year and then Shotokan the other part of the year. Very similar systems. So I combined those systems when I started my own martial arts studio, and I was teaching a system where I taught Shotokan karate forms and basics with Taekwondo kicks. And it was kind of my own thing, it wasn't, that radical, but it was pretty radical for the day. So what I did with my students was I broke my students down, as far as my student body went and how they would learn the curricula into 3 levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. There's nothing revolutionary about that. But what I did when I started to adopt a rotating curriculum is I created a 1-year curriculum, or basically 3 years of curriculum, 1 year for beginners, 1 year for intermediate, 1 year for advanced. And then the beginners would learn, the first 4 forms or whatever, right? And actually, to tell the truth, I actually got to the point where I didn't even teach forms or kata to beginners. And this would be radical to a lot. And the reason why is because I noticed when I stopped teaching forms to beginners, that they stuck around longer, and I was able to focus more on basics. I could focus more on basic techniques. Yeah. So anyway, they say they would learn the first 4 forms. So they would learn 1 new form every 3 months, right? So they'd learn 4 forms in their first year, and then if they learned all the material and they were able to test out that level at the end of that year, then they would move on to the second year curriculum. I'd move them into a different class, and then that class would all learn the next 4 forms or whatever, right? So every 3 months, I had a curricula that was a weekly curricula, basically 48 weeks of curricula because, we always took 2 weeks off for vacation. And every month it was a different curricula, but everybody in the same class at the same level was learning the same thing at the same time. Now that was revolutionary at the time because as my school grew, as I started to adopt good business and marketing practices, and I started to, get, huge kids program. I mostly focused on kids and families at the time because that was my mission. I had this mission to change the lives of children through martial arts at the time. And that was my goal. So I might have had, 150 kids in my program at one time. Not the largest school in the world, but a very successful school for where I was at and what I was doing. And, 70 to 90% of my students at any given time would be children. So for the first time ever in the history of me teaching, I wouldn't have to break my classes down into separate groups to teach them different things at the same time based on their belt level. I could teach everybody the same thing at the same time because everybody was learning the same thing at the same time, and the curriculum rotated. So in month one, we would all be learning X techniques, which was 1/12 of the beginner curriculum for that year. Then in month two, we'd be learning, Y techniques. And in month three, Z techniques. And each month represented 1/12 of the curriculum that students had to learn for that year to get through that level of learning so they can move on to the next level.
Yeah, and so that kind of differs from the traditional linear view like you touched on, because when I was coming up through the ranks, we would break out during class. If there was mixed belts, we would actually break out at some point, and everybody would be working on their own pumse, as we called them, or to anyone else that would be a kata or a form. And it didn't work very well, because even if there was more than one instructor, not everyone got attention for learning their form.
Yeah, and you would have to, you'd have to get like the more advanced students to kind of act as assistant instructors. So you might have, in your beginner's class, you might have like an orange belt or a green belt, teaching white belt. It just did not work out. Or
no,
you had to hire more instructors to help you, and it still wouldn't work out.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, talking about how revolutionary this was, I learned about it. This was back when I was a member of a client of a billing company way back in the day. And they were the last billing company I used for reasons that I outlined in my book, Small Dirty Big Profits, right?
Yep.
But I remember having a conversation with the main guy, the main consultant, one day. And I was telling him, hey, things are going well, classes are growing, blah, blah, blah. Just having a hard time with staffing. And he's like, oh, you need to implement a rotating curriculum. I was like, what the heck's that? So he kind of explained it to me, and it didn't make sense. So I started talking to other school owners that were also clients of that billing company that were successful, and, basically just, hammering them with questions to figure out how to do it. So I learned how to do it. But what was interesting was my original, I won't say my original because he wasn't my original instructor, but the instructor that I had that I met in the military, he was a Hapkido and Taekwondo instructor, Grandmaster Jim McMurray. He's actually one of the first African Americans, if not the first African American, to get a 9th Dan from the Korean Kido High in Hapkido. So, he was kind of like a trailblazer, if you were, in traditional Korean martial arts in the United States.
Big deal.
And he's still around, by the way. He still teaches seminars and stuff. Good guy. But Jim would tell me, because we'd have these conversations like after class, because I was driving from Austin all the way up to Killeen to go train with him when I was, starting my first school. And, I'd already gotten a black belt in karate. I was finishing with my black belt in Taekwondo and Hapkido. We'd have these long conversations. And one of his philosophical touch points of his teaching philosophy was that students should learn black belt techniques at white belt. That was something that he lived and died by that. And you would go to his class, and everybody in the class from black belts and white belts would be working on almost the same thing at the same time. Now, you might have some breakout sessions at the end where the black belts would go and just work on advanced stuff that the white belts were incapable of doing. But he pretty much taught everybody the same thing at the same time. And he turned out some fantastic black belts. And it was interesting to me because nobody had ever done that before. I'd never seen anybody do that before. But he's like, well, I teach my martial arts classes like a university, and somebody can come and, they could take this subject or this subject or this subject. And I want to represent everything to them at the same time, because in his mind, if a white belt learned black belt techniques, then by the time they got to the point of where they actually had to know those black belt techniques, they'd be much better at them. And, I think he had I think he was onto something back then. This was 30 years ago. Yeah, it was a long time ago.
I mean, that's a big deal for 30 years ago, because some of the research coming out that actually validates that concept was kind of obscure back then, and a lot of it probably didn't even exist. I think I mentioned this to you before in the group, but rotating curriculum, even though it's kind of traditional martial artists are allergic to the concept, at least at first. It more matches the way that humans learn, because human learning is not a strict linear progression. It's non-linear. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to actually learn a side kick before you learn a spinning side kick or a jump side kick or a back kick.
Yeah, it's really not necessary. I mean, we tend to think, that as martial artists, especially those of us who came up in traditional martial arts, in those, tried and true martial arts traditions that have been around for so long, like decades, right?
Yeah.
We like to think that our martial arts, everything's written in stone because, it's been around for, you get exposed to all this, all these lies and really dogma and propaganda in certain martial arts traditions that are almost cult-like. And they try to convince you that, these martial arts have been around and practiced for thousands of years. And that's just not
right.
so, for centuries.
It's not true.
Almost every martial art you're going to practice these days has only been around for decades.
Yeah. Taekwondo is 60 years old. Sorry, guys. Yeah. 60 years old.
I hate to tell you this, but yeah, it's true. And so the thing is, but we tend to get locked into that dogma. And to think about, to think that we can only do things the way that our instructor did them if we're going to be true to, maintaining and preserving the art, right? Because that's also another thing that's like drilled into your head in traditional martial arts systems when you're coming up in those types of atmospheres, right? That you're supposed to, be true to the art. You're supposed to be loyal to the art. You're supposed to maintain and preserve the art. You're not supposed to bastardize the art, and on and on and on and on. Yeah. Well, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is why? Why do we have to remain so true to the art? Why do we have to keep this art, like basically frozen in amber for all time, and preserve it as for what? For the purpose of historicity? Is that the reason why, or is it because of something else? Because me personally, I started doing martial arts because I wanted to know how to protect myself. And I was a goofy kid, wore thick glasses, skinny, not a big kid, not athletic at all. And just basically a bookworm. I got picked on all the time. And I got to a certain point in my childhood, probably about the time when I don't want to be crude, but when my balls started to drop, when I just decided that I wasn't going to take it anymore. And I got into a lot of fights and I got beat up sometimes. And that's why I started doing martial arts, because I didn't want to get beat up anymore. And so I wanted to know self-defense. And to me, when I finally got to the point where I had a couple of situations where I learned that what I had been learning wasn't adequate for real life self-defense situations. And I know this is going to irk a lot of traditional martial artists out there, but I had two situations that happened. One, I had gotten into a fight with an NCO when I was on active duty in the military. And this guy knew just as much Taekwondo and Hapkido and Judo as I did, but he was a hell of a lot meaner. And I tried to do all types of stuff that I'd been taught traditional martial arts on him, and it didn't work. Tried to do all kinds of, fancy wrist locks and these crazy tricks. None of it worked. Yeah, the only things that worked, here you go, learning empirically, right? The only things that worked were, straight punches, basically fisticuffs, short knees, straight kicks, and elbows, headbutts, knees, and elbows, basically. So then I had another situation not long after that where I was at home on like a weekend pass or something. And this person that I'd been drinking with, he basically, what happened was there was a gun involved, and I had to take the gun away from an individual. And I had nothing in my martial arts history, anything that I'd learned, nothing in my skills that I had acquired over the course of, say, 10 years that prepared me for that situation. I ended up falling back on something that I'd learned in basic training when we did bayonet training, when we learned how to fight with the rifle and the bayonet.
Wow.
And basically I did a butt stroke series on him, and it turned out to be a pretty good disarm for a long gun, and I took the gun away from him. But afterwards, I was scared shitless. Honestly, I was under the influence of alcohol at the time, so that kind of, muted a little bit of the fear. But the next day when I went back and I worked my way through that situation, I thought, well, I could have been killed. And it was only sheer luck that I happened to try something that wouldn't get me killed. And so that set me on a path toward learning more combative martial arts at that point. And that was, it's been a 25-year since that time, about a 25-year, journey. So in getting back to what we were talking about, keeping your art frozen in amber for all time and not innovating anything, even when you know that that art is not up to snuff, that it doesn't serve the purpose intended for you, like in my case, for instance, to learn practical self-defense and be able to defend myself in a real world situation, it's counterintuitive, and it's not sustainable. It's not something that that you can do. And so you end up with this cognitive dissonance that tells you, what I'm practicing in the dojo, 90% of it doesn't make sense for real life. Why am I doing this? So, we have to ask ourselves why. Why are we trying to preserve things like this, this moment in time? Doesn't make sense.
Sure. And I think a lot of people would say, hey, we're preserving it because this is how the masters did it, and they must have known something. My answer to that would be, your masters all practiced something different than they taught. Especially Okinawan karate. They all practiced something different than they taught their students. I think, who was it? It was Itosu, I think. And there's a bunch of Shorin-ryu strains that come from Itosu. They all teach something different because all of their patriarchs learned something different from Itosu. So it's not true. It's like, it's not true.
Yeah. And, what's funny too is that.
Hey guys, real quick before the episode continues. If you're wondering how you can supercharge your training in a way that helps you actually perform better on the mat or in the ring, I've got the perfect thing for you. I've taken the scientific concept known as transfer of learning and distilled it down into a handful of dead simple, easy to understand rules you can use to supercharge your training today. And the best part is that it almost always makes training more fun, not less. Now you don't have to spend hours and hours of drilling just to fail when your practice gets tested in sparring or competition. Instead, you can take these simple rules and transform your drills and exercises into rapid skill-building machines. Your classmates and training partners won't believe your progress. And if you're an instructor, your students will get better faster than ever and have more fun while doing it. Go to combatlearning.com/transfer to sign up to our email list and grab your transfer cheat sheet now. Plus, you'll never miss an episode and get access to exclusive tips. And just to say thanks, I'll send you my Introduction to Motor Learning for Martial Arts PDF so you can get up to speed on the powerful concepts we're discussing on this podcast. So go to combatlearning.com/transfer now to get your cheat sheet and other goodies. That's combatlearning.com/transfer, TRANSFER.
If you look at some of those historical, characters, whatever you want to call them, figures, like take Choki Matobu, for instance, that guy was a brawler,
Right.
I don't think I think from what I recall, it's been a long time since I delved into Okinawan karate history, but from what I recall, he wasn't good on kata,
No, he didn't like it too much. He just liked Naihanchi, and that's all he liked, really.
Yeah. And the other funny thing is if you look at a lot of the modern martial arts traditions, and when I say modern, what I mean is non-Koryu traditions, right? Mm-hmm. You look at a lot of the modern martial arts traditions in the Japanese and Korean lineages especially, and what you find is that you have a founder who trained for, sometimes less than a decade, that said, you know what, I've got a better way. And they had the, chutzpah to create their own thing, and that's what they did. And we can argue that in many cases, these people were geniuses, that they were like, just phenomenal at what they did, or they had, talent that was above and beyond what other people had or whatever. Bruce Lee is probably the biggest modern example of that. But, you could argue like, say, like Kyokushin founder, a Judo founder, a Shotokan founder, whatever, that, we could argue that they were geniuses at what they did, but really, I don't think that's the case. I think they just decided that they didn't like the way their instructors were doing things and they did things differently. But people worship at the feet of those founders now, Another one is Helio Gracie, which, thank goodness, that you had people like him that innovated, but there's a documentary that's going to be coming out soon called Closed Guard. And I think it's Robert Drysdale that's coming out with that documentary. And he's been doing a lot of research into how Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu actually developed. And boy, I think that it's going to blow a lot of the propaganda out of the water for sure.
Oh, it's propaganda. It's definitely propaganda, and not to pull anything away from the Gracies, but it's
phenomenal.
And they were in contact with like wrestlers and things like that. They had to change their tactics. They learned from other arts during that time.
Mm.
I mean, there's a lot, and especially with the jiu-jitsu we have today. Think about the main patriarchs right now, the second and third generation of Gracies. Almost all of them cross-trained in judo, 3 or 4 different styles of wrestling, sambo. I mean, there's pictures of like the Machados and like I think even one of the Gracies like wearing sambo shirts and freestyle wrestling and training with, you know, some of the old greats of wrestling, you know, decades ago. I mean, it's the story that it's pure Gracie jiu-jitsu and that, you know, they got something from Maeda and made it distinct and that's just their thing and it beat everybody is really not true.
Yeah, and you know, like, you know, the flavor of the month now, which is, you know, kind of cool, is, you know, leg locks, right? Everybody's doing leg locks. Mm-hmm. But until people came along, like, you know, like Josh Barnett and Dean Lister, that started, you know, leg locking the crap out of other Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts, you know, they didn't really do those techniques. They had some foot locks and some ankle locks in their system that were taught, but they weren't taught a lot. You know, they weren't really emphasized. And, you know, I mean, let's face it, you know, the majority of those techniques they're teaching came from Russian Sambo and from folk wrestling, you know, from European and American folk wrestling. You know, these hook and catch guys, catch wrestlers, you know, and, you know, I mean, Josh Barnett's a primary example of that. So, you know, but yet, if you listen to the history that some people continue to spread, if you will, in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community, you would think that they were doing all those techniques 100 years ago. Now, here's what's interesting, though. If you go back and you look at old video footage and you look at old books and photos and things like that of, say, like, you know, old Kodokan Judo, right?
Yeah.
You'll find instructors doing similar techniques. So it's not like the techniques weren't there, but they were definitely de-emphasized over, say, the last 60 years or so due to various reasons, which is going back to what you said, that the instructors teach what they like, and they teach what they like at a given period of time. So for us to take what our instructors give us and say, this is the only way, and it shall not be any other way, you shall not change it, is ridiculous, because it stifles innovation. And what it does is it eventually, what it does is it kills the art, pure and simple, which is why I think, you know, getting back to rotating curricula, why I think teaching through a rotating curricula and being unafraid to change what you're doing and to go from a linear teaching pattern to something that's a little bit more malleable and customizable to the student is, I think, a better option.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be a little nerdy about, like, I mentioned something about the sidekick and how you don't have to learn a sidekick chamber and a regular sidekick before you actually do a spinning sidekick or a jump sidekick. And a lot of people, they're gonna gasp and clutch their pearls and be like, "How could you say something like you're a Taekwondo guy? Like, how could you say something like that?" And really, if you motion capture all of those different versions of all those mutations of the sidekick, and you look at them on a video, and you can look at Kuki-Wan instructional videos and actually find this mentioned, not the concept, but the actual differences mentioned. There is a disparity in the timing of where you release the sidekick chamber versus when you do a regular sidekick or a back leg sidekick versus a spinning sidekick. And there's often a difference in where you hold it, a small distance, but difference rather, but noticeable between those techniques and the way that you have to move your hips. Yes, they look similar, but there's a difference in what you might call relative timing and positioning between the kicks that really makes them different, totally different techniques that can be taught concurrently. You could learn all three at the same time if you wanted to. Maybe not in the same class. That would probably not be a great idea. But you could learn it in the same cycle or in the same 6 months, or, however your rotating curriculum moves. Those techniques, they're not advanced, right? That's like, I believe it's Matt Thornton that said that jiu-jitsu really doesn't have basic, intermediate, and advanced techniques. It has basically just techniques. And the difference between you and a black belt is not how many techniques but your ability to perform that technique.
Yeah, and that's pretty much true for virtually every martial art. I mean, one of the things that I discovered in helping instructors develop their own rotating curricula over the years in multiple different martial arts systems is that most martial arts systems, as far as the curricula or the techniques that need to be learned up to black belt, only consist usually of about a dozen standard basic techniques or movements. Under 150 is what we'll say. And I've had instructors argue that with me. They'll say, well, my system has 3,000 techniques. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. What your system has is you have less than 150 core techniques. And then everything after that are just variations of those 150 core techniques. And that is almost universal across different martial arts systems. And the reason why is because the human body only moves in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. And there's only so many different ways you can move the body to hurt another person. Simple as that.
Right.
Now, there are always going to be variations on the way a technique is thrown. We could take examples like the difference between, like a reverse punch in Shotokan karate and a right cross in boxing or whatever, there are a million examples of that. But most martial arts systems only have less than 150 core techniques. And then everything else after that are variations. So in creating a rotating curriculum, the first thing you have to determine is what are the less than 150 core techniques in my system? And how do I break that up in such a way where I can teach that over a 3 or 4 year period to a student or what have you, or teach it in 3 or 4 different levels? Now, we've been talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and one of the questions I often get is, okay, so if you're teaching Taekwondo, in Taekwondo schools, many times, not in my school, but in most schools, students can get a black belt in, 3 years, right? It's not uncommon to see, a student get their black belt in 3 years in a Taekwondo school. My schools, it was more like 5, but that's because, I came from a Japanese karate lineage too. Yeah. But the question I get from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructors is, okay, so it takes, easily 8 to 10 years for a student to go from white belt to black belt. What do I do? How do I teach those classes? I can't just, have a 3-year curriculum. Do I need to have a 10-year curriculum? And my answer is no, because what you have is you have a basic curriculum, an intermediate curriculum, and an advanced curriculum that all repeat. And what you want to do when you're delivering information, when you're delivering instruction through using those different curricula, you need to use some sort of spaced interval learning where you're repeating techniques and bringing them back into the mix and so forth every so often. So your, say, purple belt student, are still going back and they're reviewing and going back over, stuff that they learned when they were a white and blue belt and so on and so forth. Now, for most purple belts and brown belts, because, there aren't that many core techniques in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I will argue. Most purple belts and brown belts, they really don't need to do that because they're drilling those techniques all the time anyway, if not in class and sparring. But it's helpful from a learning perspective to do that, to make sure that you're reinforcing basic technique. And also in your school, even though there will be variations in how instructors teach different techniques, every instructor is going to have a way that they want people to, students to do their techniques. And it helps to be able to reinforce, your methodology to your students while you're still letting them develop their own methodologies as well.
Right. Everyone has their own kind of base variation of what they teach, and then it kind of let you move out from there and learn variations. But that's really a great point. And that you're touching on kind of one of my other questions is like how to structure a rotating curriculum. And it sounds like, you don't have to put everyone in the one class type that repeats. You can kind of segment it out by rough, like beginner, intermediate, advanced levels, and then have each of those repeat until you kind of move your way from one rung to the other. Is that accurate?
It's true. And, like say right now, I teach Krav Maga. So that's what I've been doing. That's been my focus for about the last 5 years. I also trained under Burton Richardson. Burton Richardson has his MMA for the Street curriculum, which, that and I ended up getting a blue belt under Bert. Bert was the one that promoted me in BJJ for the Street. He's a BJJ for the Street curriculum.
Okay.
So, those curricula, as well as his Battlefield Kali curricula, they work very well with Krav Maga. They kind of fill in the gaps that Krav doesn't have. And I started doing Krav Maga. I'll just say I started doing it because I like self-defense, but then also they had some skills that I wasn't being taught in other martial arts systems, like gun disarms.
Uh-huh.
And they deal with a lot more awareness and stuff like that. But in my Krav classes, what I do is, I have a curricula for level 1. A rotating curriculum for level 1. I have a rotating curriculum for level 2, a rotating curriculum for level 3. Because you basically, in Krav from white to black belt, you more or less have 5 levels in most systems. And so what I do is for my level 1 students is I have a 3 to 4 month, a 12 to 16 week rotating curriculum for that level. And we do it 3 to 4 times a year. So for a student, to get through the level 1 curriculum, they have to repeat that curriculum at least 3 or 4 times. So they're getting reinforcement of those techniques over and over and over again. And same thing for the level 2 curriculum and so forth. So my students might move through the ranks just maybe slower than some commercial Krav Maga schools, but I don't really care. What I care about is them getting the information in a logical progression and reinforcing that information over time to where they're not just learning the skills, but they're able to apply the skills in real time, which is so important when you're learning an art that professes to be a practical self-defense art.
Yeah, so that leads me to my next question, and that's what does lesson planning look like with a rotating curriculum?
Well, for starters, this is what I tell all my business coaching clients, is that you never walk out on the mat without a plan, without a lesson plan. The one thing that I encourage my business coaching clients to do, strongly encourage them to do, is to have a 48-week lesson plan for beginners, intermediate, and advanced students, right? So that way, and you can write it as you go along. You don't have to write it all at once. That's something that is overwhelming to most instructors. What you should do is you should create the bones of the lesson plan, right? Or the bones of the curriculum, I should say, for each year, and say, okay, in year 1, students need to learn, or I want students to learn these techniques. It's not necessarily that they have to learn those techniques in year 1 and then other techniques in year 2 and other techniques in year 3, although it should be a logical progression of technical, difficulty, right? Mm-hmm. But you figure out what you want students to learn in year 1, and then you break all those skills up according to month, quarter, and year, right? Mm-hmm. And then after that, you start writing weekly lesson plans that follow the techniques, the core techniques that are actually delivering instruction on the core techniques a student has to learn for that month, that quarter, right? Now, here's the thing. When you break your system down like that, what you're going to find is that, okay, so students have to learn, let's say we're talking about Shotokan karate, right? And let's say it's the first quarter of the year for my beginner class. And let's say for this month, and this is just an example, this is not actually what my curriculum was, but let's say, for example, I want students to learn front stance, low block, inside to outside block, high block, reverse punch, and front kick during that month. Let's just say that's the case, right? Mm-hmm. Well, depending on how good of an instructor you are, you might bore your students to death by the end of the month by just repeating those same techniques in every single class. But what a rotating curriculum does for you is it gives you the freedom to allow you to go, okay, so in this week, we're going to focus on this technique, and this is the techniques we're going to focus on to make sure the students learn them. But, I don't have to spend the whole class teaching those techniques. I just have to make sure the students learn them. So then I can add in other stuff to add variety and so forth, and also spaced interval learning to where I'm bringing back in, techniques that we did the previous weeks or the previous months or whatever, to kind of review those techniques and so forth. So it doesn't lock you into something where you have to, have this boring, repetitious curriculum, right? These boring, repetitious classes. Mm-hmm. Instead, what it does is it gives you the freedom through being organized to go, okay, I know exactly what I need to cover this week and this month and so forth. The students know exactly what they need to learn this week and this month and so forth in order to do their next test or progress, check or whatever. And so, I know that I can get that stuff out of the way. And then we can do other stuff that maybe will be a little bit more stimulating and fun for the students as well.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. And for any, I was hung up on this. I was guilty of that too, really boring my students when I first started teaching. And eventually it opened up, and it got to where I was teaching within a franchise at the time. It got to where corporate came down, and the guy was like, "Wow, this is one of the best mats I've seen in the entire company." But I didn't start that way, and it was actually your resources really helped me with this. I had to get out of the really traditional mindset that I had inherited about classes and even about pedagogy and things like that, and realize, just because you're not performing a technique the exact same way, or because you're not doing it for an hour straight or every day or every week, doesn't mean that learning and development is not taking place. In fact, what's called mass practice, where you just spend an hour on the same technique, or you keep revisiting that same technique every day, can actually be detrimental to your learning, because there's no period of consolidation taking place between those periods. There's no disruptions that actually kind of help you create a stronger and more adaptable movement pattern. I know it's getting a little nerdy there, but you can put a technique in 3 or 4 different games, and it doesn't have to be executed the same way for your students, especially kids, to be learning it better. And you can take a break for 2 or 3 weeks or however long, and come back around to it.
Yeah, and I would say, like, the flip side of that is, if you're boring your students to death, they're going to zone out in class anyway, and that in and of itself is going to stifle learning. That's going to stop learning tracks. When your students are so bored, they're just zoning out and they're just going through the motions. They're not learning anything at that time. And I would argue also, when you get to that point, that they're just reinforcing bad technique. Now, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, because there's something that I think we need to cover, and that is a question or response or retort that I get from traditional martial arts instructors most often, about belt rank testing and rotating curriculum. So one thing that martial arts instructors will tell me when I introduce these concepts to them is, they'll say, well, if I do things this way, that means that I'll have a brand new white belt learning, doing green belt techniques for their yellow belt. And I'm like, so who the hell cares? If you have 4 belt ranks, say you've got students who are going to test every 3 months in a traditional, Taekwondo or karate school, right? So let's say you have 4 belt ranks for the first year, and those 4 belt ranks represent the curricula that a student has to learn during their first year of training, right? Who cares if they learn the 3rd form for their first belt or not, as long as they learn all that material and all that curriculum before they move on to the next level of training. Before they graduate from the beginner class to the intermediate class. Who cares what order they learn it in and what belt they get for whatever order they learn it in? It doesn't matter. It does not matter. All that matters is that you're able to deliver curriculum and deliver instruction in the most effective way possible for your students. And I will tell you, after having done this for 20 years, this is a much more effective way of teaching students than teaching in a linear fashion. And it doesn't really bother me, because, like, in my school, when I was teaching Taekwondo and karate, every student was learning the same thing at the same time in the same class. So all the students would get tested at the end of the quarter. Every quarter, all the students would test over the same material, performing the same material for whatever their next belt rank was at that time, depending on what time of the year they started that class, right? And so it made it so much easier to test, and it also makes it easier for the students to learn, because they're all learning the same thing at the same time. So they can help each other learn the same thing at the same time. Because instead of, one student off by themselves, because they're the only one that has to learn X technique, trying to learn this technique on their own, they're in a group of, say 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 students learning the same thing at the same time, so they can look left and right, see what other students are doing, pick up cues from them and so forth. Everybody helps each other. And you end up with students performing at a much higher level than they normally would otherwise.
Absolutely. And you talked about spaced learning back there, which is an important concept to me. And one thing I wanted to circle back on real quick is, and I struggled with this as a teacher as well. And really when we watch our students and we come back around to material that they've learned, we expect for their performance to be immediately better, so that we can actually move to the next layer of detail to help them refine the technique. But you actually want, when you come back around to a technique, you actually want them to make mistakes and forget parts of the technique, because in making those mistakes and finding the correct movement pattern, the spaced repetition effect comes into play. And what we found in the research is actually that the retention is stronger. So you can make a technique, you can make a student rather perform the technique perfect in class. Um, and then they'll come back in the next class and it'll be 30% worse, and that's normal. And you actually want them to have that missing piece of information, because in rediscovering how to do the technique, it actually makes the learning, the retention of learning, stronger going forward after that. So you have to be patient with the performance aspect, knowing that the learning aspect that you can't really see, that's more invisible, is that's being strengthened in the long run, so that months, years down the road, their performance is going to be a lot more stable. But you get to that point faster than if you try to make them be perfect every single time.
And that's one of the strengths of a rotating curriculum, is because you can repeat the same techniques and the same curriculum and the same lessons in different ways over the course of, say, a year, that a student will be learning the techniques at that level.
Absolutely.
And I actually simplified my rotating curriculum when I transitioned from teaching in my own martial arts studio in a commercial space, and I shifted gears and did a career change and so forth. I still wanted to teach, so I started teaching in part-time locations, like I did when I first started, which is fine, and made it a great second income from it and so forth. But one of the things I realized was that when you're teaching in part-time locations, your classes tend to be a little bit less stable. The student body tends to be a little less stable and a little bit more transient. Mm-hmm. So I found that I had to simplify my curriculum a great deal in order to make sure that I was delivering technique to everybody effectively, with that sort of more transient student body, right? Retention just isn't as good student retention. So I simplified it to where we're repeating the same curriculum 3 to 4 times a year. And students will repeat that same curriculum 3 to 4 times and go through the same techniques in the same order 3 or 4 times before they graduate into the next level. And what I found is all that reinforcement helps. It really does. It makes for students that are have much stronger skills and skills that are much more concrete.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, I think that's all my questions. I think everything I wanted to cover has been covered. What about you?
Yeah, pretty much. And, I'll just say, for those people out there who are staunch traditionalists, people who hear this or hearing this podcast or this interview or what have you, and that are thinking that they absolutely must learn like certain techniques, certain forms, certain kata or whatever in a specific order. What I'm going to tell you is that the only reason why you have to do that is because your instructors or organization are telling you to do that. Simple as that. There is no there's no science, there's no research, there is no pedagogical reason why you have to learn certain martial arts techniques in a certain particular order, or certain kata in a certain particular order. And I can tell you, after doing this for better than 20 years, if I have a new student who came into my classes and they learn the 4th kata first, it doesn't matter, because to the student, they have no idea. They've never learned martial arts before. They have no idea that the 4th kata is supposed to be technically harder than the 1st kata, right? It doesn't matter. And you end up at the end of the day actually with a student who is more proficient for having learned the same techniques with everybody else in their class at the same time than you do with students that are learning things piecemeal as you break up your class into different groups and jump from group to group and try to split your attention through 3 or 4 different groups over 3 or 4 different groups at once. So if you're considering doing this and you think you're going to get some pushback from your organization or whatever, I'm going to tell you that you have to do what's necessary to run your own business and to save your own school and do what's best for your own students. And if your organization or association or instructor or what have you won't allow you to do that, maybe it's time to consider moving on.
That's excellent advice. I think the only thing I would add to that is if you're still struggling after all that, ask yourself a few questions. Why are you teaching in this order? If you have some sort of specific pedagogical reason, why do you believe that reason is valid? Do you have research? Maybe you say, well, I have experience. Well, do you have experience in multiple types of teaching? Because our experience sometimes can be, we can have, confirmation bias. So why is it that you believe these things about teaching? Why do you have these assumptions about your pedagogy? And I would just really dig deep and keep asking yourself questions. And if you can't answer them, then maybe it's time to start looking for a different way to teach because it'll make your life easier.
Yeah, that's why I started doing it. Is that my life was very complicated as an instructor at the time before I adopted the idea of a rotating curriculum. And it definitely made my life easier. That's for sure.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, Mike, thank you for coming on the show. I'll put Small Dojo Big Profits and links to the ebooks. And I think you still got your page up for Small Dojo Big Profits, right? Yeah,
the site's still up. You can still order it on that site. There's it's probably, I don't know if I have it half off on the site, but the 50% off code just for your listeners, I think is Lockdown 2020, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm not sure about that. I know that was something I gave to somebody the other day. It's been a while since I set that up.
Yeah.
But I want to add to before we leave.
Sure.
I don't have anything to sell. I do sell stuff, but I don't make my primary income from doing martial arts consulting or selling books or whatever. If you saw my royalty check for the books that I sell on Amazon that are martial arts business resources, you would laugh. It's not a lot. The stuff is out there because I wanted to get it out there and I wanted to help martial arts instructors. So don't think I have a financial or a financial interest in that type of dog in this fight. That's not it. But if you go out and buy my stuff, sure, I appreciate it. And if it helps you, that's even better.
Awesome. Thank you for I didn't even realize you had a code, but what I'll do is you can confirm that and when I release this episode, because it's going to be on maybe a week or two, or actually probably more than that, I think August. I'll make sure that the correct code is in the liner notes, and if you happen to listen on YouTube, I'll put it in the description. So once we've confirmed that, everything will be in the description for you guys.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you, Mike, for coming on. I hope we can do this again sometime in the future.
Yeah, for sure, man. Be happy to come back on sometime.
Thanks so much for listening to the Combat Learning Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. It really helps us out. Finally, this episode, including the intro music, is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.